This is my father's shame. Today I take back the honor he lost. I call a home gang! Here! Against the Oathbreaker!
I will make you beg, as your father begged, Wolfkin.
So this is it, the big one, the big analysis of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The biggest comparison I've done across the biggest selection of consoles on the market right now. 6 of them in total. Sorry, 7. 7 in total. That's a lot of consoles. That's a lot of comparisons. That's a great deal of footage. That's a hell of a lot of sneaking around with a hood over my head and diving off of perches from very high up. Let's find out where they all fall in the all-important pecking order. Let's start by giving Ubisoft praise where it's due. It's another rich and vast open world, beautiful countryside with a fitting recreation of medieval England and medieval Scandinavia from where the Vikings once came and invaded England, and all of that does a consistent job across the board. It looks good, it feels good, and it certainly has a great design and artistry. Pretty strong character design and a pretty consistent look overall that has some beautiful points during its dynamic time of day. All of that cannot be commended enough. Great use of lighting, volumetric lights, and excellent use of draw calls in terms of swamping the world with loads of details and objects at any one time. It feels very vast, very full, and the foliage and interaction is actually quite impressive for a title of this size and scale. But overall, it's a typical Assassin's Creed title. There is too much merging, I feel, of all of their different formats now merging in together. So you've now got a lot of elements in the title that come from other games such as Far Cry, and certainly For Honor. The sieging of the castles and the castle grounds is almost the same. You can see where that inspiration has come from. It's not a bad thing, but I think it's a bit too obvious here in terms of the setting, the Vikings, the animation and the textures have all been shared, and that's fine, but I would like a little bit of its own identity to be kept in all of their games from Far Cry, Watch Dogs and Assassin's Creed, and I feel like Assassin's Creed is losing it a little bit in terms of its identity. It's certainly an RPG now, it pushes the RPG elements much harder here. It's a little easier to play, it's not as, you haven't got as many bullet sponges, so to speak, in terms of the characters at the start of the game. The combat's pretty good, it's varied, you can ramp yourself up in certain styles and combat techniques, and you can lean more stealth way or range attack or melee attack, so all that is very, very good. There are some weaknesses in the gameplay as always. The storyline is inconsistent, it doesn't stand out, the script writing's not great, and the characters are inconsistent, they flip-flop back and forth, and it doesn't have a consistency that it used to have with games like Black Flag or Unity. Ultimately, it's an Assassin's Creed title, but it doesn't have much passion in its storytelling or character-driven development. I would prefer it to use key historical moments and use those to hit story beats and pivotal points in the story itself and history. That would be more preferable to me, but that's a personal thing. Moving off that and onto the technical analysis. One thing that does merge the two, and that's the AI. The AI is pretty poor. I mean, if you're a Viking coming from Scandinavia into England, I mean, what kind of language do you expect to hear?
Who are these men?
They speak with twisted accents. English, no doubt.
Dag, Eivor! On me!
All jokes aside though, the AI is still lacking in this title. The view frustum and the pathfinding of characters can be poor, they can get stuck on areas, and obviously you can kill people within a few feet, and unless you're in the frustum view of their cone of view field, they don't see anything. They stand around staring at walls and just waiting to be killed. There's no sense of intelligence there, and it makes the stealth elements feel poor, and it also means it's not utilising the hardware as well as it probably could, certainly the CPUs, but with this being the last time we're likely to see an Assassin's Creed title on the S and the PS4, maybe this will be something they ramp up in the next iteration in 2 years' time. It's one area that really starts to feel old and dated now, specifically if you've played more modern titles that really utilise AI and make you feel as if you're combating against somebody that actually has half a brain.
Now stand aside, worthy adversary.
'Tis but a scratch.
A scratch? Your arm's off.
Yeah, the Black Knight will probably put up a better fight. It is but a flesh wound. But aside that, the visuals are impressive. The scale of the title in terms of where you can travel, the water physics, the water simulation and the bobbing of objects in the water, not only the boats but other objects as you hop over them. It's Probably a lot of it's pre-calculated in terms of the range that it has, but it's good. The water physics and the simulation of water itself is all excellent. It's not that much better than what we saw back in Black Flag, but it still works. And that variety is what they've built. They just iterate and build on the scale in the game, but we've seen this multiple times. The same goes for the tessellated snow. It works really well, and the depth and the tessellation, like I covered in my previous analysis, it can have very obvious scaling issues, or at least tessellating issues, very close to the frustum when you move, and it's frustum aligned, so it can move and bob around, which gives a kind of a weavy floor effect when it's tessellating the ground, when it leaving chunks of snow left. But when you're walking through heaps of snow and leaving trails behind you, and horses and other characters are, again, it's just an exceptional piece of additional technology that actually adds atmosphere and graphical quality to a game. It looks like snow, it feels like snow, and it gives you great views off into the distance. Even in England, you've got snow-capped mountains off in the distance, and even though the English Isle is there, it's just a very small portion of England. Don't think it's actually that small if you've never been here, but it's great that it is there, and the variety between the snowy, dusty mountains of the Scandinavian countryside and the bright autumn leaves and greenery of England is very good. The good representation of East Anglia and all of its glory. But there's more to the title than that. Finally, after all this time of constantly saying it's one of the biggest issues of the title, they've added per object motion blur. Very, very good variety as well. Other titles from Ubisoft have had it, but now it's in here and it works exceptionally well. It just adds smoothness to the animation frames, and that 30 FPS feels so much better for it there. But luckily, the high quality 60 FPS mode on both the Series X and the PS5 also offers it up, and it works very well. And like all the elements in the title, it's on every single version, from the PS5 right down to the Xbox One S. Obviously, tearing is a conversation we'll get to in a bit. Other elements in the title are all abundant, so great shadow maps, multiple cascades. A little foolishly, they're better on the Xbox One S than they are on the Xbox One X. They're not as good on the Series S, and they're best on Series X and PS5, obviously, due to the much higher quality GPU throughput. It can be seen visibly across the board, as can their ever so slightly high quality resolution on the PS5 shadow maps over the Series X. Now it is slight and it could be time of day, but bloom and crepuscular rays also show a slight improvement on the PS5 than they do on the Series X. It could also be dynamic time of day, but consistently this favours the PS5 over the Series X, and it's not the only element in this analysis that does favour the PS5. They both push the culling of animation frames further out, so 60 FPS rather than 15 on the lower end consoles. Physics simulation can also be cut back. That happens on all versions as well. That's a standard cutback. And then generally across the board, the lower quality versions of the consoles cut back obvious things like shadow map resolution, culling distance of LODs, tessellation levels in terms of the frustum distance. All of those areas are cut back. Generally, the higher consoles are the better quality of the lot, but the Series S has bigger sacrifices as well than the others, so it itself cuts back shadow map quality and tessellation culling. So the Series S is quite disappointing. I'm not going to lie. It's the most disappointing analysis here, aside... well, in fact, let me sum that up. The Xbox generally isn't in the right state. The condition of the Xbox versions across the board is not where it should be compared to where it is against the PlayStation consoles. That's for definite. But let's get into the resolutions. Let's get into the comparisons. Let's get into the visuals. So the game itself really does scale well with resolution, but it's not just resolution. It's a good example of what I've been saying for years, which is how unimportant resolution really is past a certain point. Now, the Xbox One S proves how important resolution is by being so incredibly low, and then anything beyond the PS4 Pro, the Series S, shows you that it doesn't matter anymore. It gets to a point where it's diminishing returns, and it doesn't really make a difference unless your nose is pressed right up against the screen. It also proves that asset quality materials and shading is the most important part, not the depth buffer or the geometry buffer. That's what we count, the geometry, not the shading. So here we're going to go through the texture quality. Look at his shirt, look at his face, look at the scars, look at the pores of his skin. As I zoom in, look at the shirt and his collars, the stitching on the shirt. You can see the difference in detail. The S is better than the Pro, but the detail on the face, the scars, are better on the Pro. And then the tattoos on his head. Look at the refinement of the stubble of his shaved head on the X. And then we go to the S, which is the best of the lot. But you can see it's sacrificing the details on his shirt. Look at the stitching areas, and then the X, and then the PS5 are the best of the lot. Obviously, this shows that it's not just about resolution, because at points the Xbox One S looks better than the Pro. This is about the memory mapping, the amount of space you've got to draw textures, load them in and stream them in, and it shows how disconnected or removed from the pipeline bitmaps are, because it's using that space to allocate the best quality textures at certain points in the shot, and therefore others are sacrificed. And at points the Xbox One S is better than the S, that's got sacrifices on the shirt, but generally when you move up and down the pipe you can see the quality here. Resolution has an impact on his hair, the dithering around the edge, all that clarity is gone, but the asset materials and the quality make the biggest impact, far more than just having a higher resolution. And you can see that when I zoom in here on the details on the ground, the resolution is actually so low on the Xbox One, but it's got better quality assets at certain points. When I zoom in on the Pro, you can see the tessellation is cut back on the Pro, and it's running too high on the Xbox One S. It's running at the same level as the S and the X, and that's crazy at this distance. You've got detail on the house that here you can't see on the PS4 because it's not there, and you can't see it on the Xbox One S even though it's drawing it because the resolution is too low. It's a combination of two things, and you have to merge that together. Once you get to a certain resolution, like I say 1440p in my opinion, then everything else means you can balance that out better. If you start running a game at 4K but have really low quality assets, materials and texture management, it doesn't matter. A blurry texture at 4K is still a blurry texture. So this is not to say that resolution is completely redundant. It's not. The sampling rate is important. Here on the left hand side you can see the resolution of screen space is lower on the Xbox One S, and it's much higher on the PS4, the PS4 Pro. They're all pretty much the same at this point, right up to the Xbox One S, and then they're the best of the lot on the X and the PS5. But again, reflections, like many things, are more than just the resolution quality. It's about the stochastic samples, the noise, the surface normals, the specular level, and also the Fresnel level, the dynamic level on water where it ripples and the tessellation affects the reflection level, so it gets higher and lower. That specular reflectance is different. All of that, contact hardening, surface normals, roughness, all of those make a difference. But when you get into the game and compare them side by side, there's hardly any difference between the X and the PS5. Other versions do scale more significantly, but whether one was 20-30% higher resolution, once you're above 1440, 1620p, it becomes almost a misnomer to talk about it. Everything else is the same, the volumetrics, the LOD, the swaps of LOD, the draw distance, and then it's all cut back on the lower end console. So there's not a vast amount in it in terms of sacrifices. They're all very intelligent, and I think I've covered them in depth at this point. Some of the tessellation level of the ground is cut back on the lower consoles, but again, it's not a huge sacrifice, but you can notice it in cutscenes. But generally across the board, they're very, very close. So moving into pixel counts, what I've done here is an average between the highest, the lowest, and where they come out more often than not in my counts, and then at the top you can see the scaling levels between the versions. You can see that the PS4 and the Pro version scale the least other than the Series S, and there's a good reason why I'm highlighting that, which I'll touch on in a moment. And the Xbox One S is got the wrong settings, so it causes other issues. But generally, Xbox One X, SX and PS5 come out at 1620p, but that temporal resolution, the fact that it's 60 FPS not 30, makes a bigger difference to the image quality than just being the same resolution. And as I've already alluded to, the texture quality, the assets, the settings, all the materials, they're better on the SX and the PS5, and therefore it's better image quality along with that temporal improvement. But when you scale from the top to the bottom, there's lots of areas that affect the image quality and the overall visual presentation. Resolution is just one of them. But all these things combine to give us our final metric, and that is performance. So starting from the slowest end, the bottom end, the Xbox One S and the PS4 with their resolution targets we just mentioned, you can see that the Xbox One S tears all the time. It's horrible. It looks terrible on a massive screen because it's constantly tearing. And it's the beginning of the issues around the Xbox One version. Now, this is largely down to the fact that the settings are incorrect on the Xbox One. As I just said, the shadows maps are too high, the LOD's too high, it needs to cut back on the depth of field in terms of the effects. It probably needs to cut back on the motion blur as well, or just remove it. There's certain GPU elements, the bloom, the crepuscular rays, all of those need to be cut back more. The tessellation and the distance, like I've just mentioned. There's certain areas that would make a bigger difference in terms of performance, and that's because the game's got VSync turned off. And this is, again, this general shift around using one GDK to ship out games. You can configure it and change it and all that kind of good stuff, but there definitely seems to be a mismatch on the Xbox One versions, because you've got better settings at points on the S than you have on the X or the Series S, and then you've got worse performance. It's terrible. Now, the PS4 is not great, let's be honest. It does tear very, very occasionally, but it really holds VSync most of the time. It skips into the next refresh cycle, and that might be a driver issue on the Xbox One, I don't know, with the latest update, by them just seemingly using VSync, adaptive VSync all the time. I've heard people say about VRR, it's stupid. No company should sensibly deliver a game based on a 0.1% of the market that's got a VRR refresh screen at this point to fix the issue. That's not a solution at all, and that's not the reason they've done it. There's other reasons. So performance is bad on the Xbox One S, worst of the lot, and it's not great on the PS4 at certain points. This is probably the worst points you'll see, but it doesn't hold 30 at all times. Arguably, it's still better than a lot of other older Assassin's Creed titles, though. And then you move up the pipe, and you go to other titles or other versions, and it doesn't really do that much better. Remember, they all target 30, but the consistency here is the Xbox versions tear, and the PlayStation versions largely don't. The PS4 Pro version, as I just mentioned, with its scaling and its set resolution, is almost perfect, because it just holds 30 most of the time. The Xbox One X tears more often than I like. It's nowhere near as bad as the S, but it does do it, and then it can skip frames when it's cutting from one scene to the next with physics and all that kind of mesh loading into the next shot. But generally throughout play, it's just tearing and hovering anywhere between 25 and 27 FPS. It's just not a nice game to look at on a large screen. It looks good because of the quality, the resolution, all that kind of good stuff, but it needs lowered. It just needs to be targeting probably similar levels to the Pro, maybe a little higher, and it would have a more consistent presentation. But bear in mind, the Xbox One X is more powerful than the Pro, so we shouldn't be seeing these kind of levels just because you want to target a 4K output. So there's definitely that, and these consistencies of issues carry over to the Series S as well. It outperforms the Xbox One X, it tears less often because it's got a less stressful setting for its GPU levels, because it's cutting back for obvious settings, and it's not trying to reach an unreachable target in terms of this title. If the PS5 and the Xbox Series X can't target 4K, why on the earth is the Xbox One X having that as a target, even at 30 FPS? It's just silly. So that would be my first win. There are some stutters here on loading, but that can happen occasionally on all versions, so that's a little unfair to the Xbox One X, but it's just the way it happened. It does happen more often on the Xbox One X, I must admit, but it's not the only reason. And then you obviously move over to the PS5 and the Series X, and they're very close, let's be clear. Just like my last analysis, they're very close, but digging into it more, getting into England, certain parts, yeah, it tears more often on the Series X. It drops frames more often on the Series X, and it just falls behind the PS5 in terms of overall performance. It can occasionally tear on the PS5. If it does, it's going to be in a cutscene or shots with heavy GPU draw. As you can see here, lots of sun, sharp textures, water physics, reflections, GPU, SSR, all that kind of stuff. But generally, if it tears on the PS5, it's tearing more often on the Xbox One. If it drops a frame on the PS5, it's dropping more often on the Xbox One. And at certain points, you can get upwards of 5 frames per second delta between the two. So 10-12% difference in terms of performance, and if the Xbox One X was allowed to run to VSync and not tear the level it does, it would actually be worse, because that's actually saving it a little bit of performance. So on average, the PS5 is better performing than the Xbox One X, and it has a couple of extra effects as I've just covered, but generally it's an identical version with slightly less performance. In general, this game is GPU bound far more than it's ever CPU bound. In fact, I doubt it's CPU bound on both of these consoles. It could probably run into the hundreds if it wasn't for the fact that the GPU has been heavily stressed, and that means that most of the times you see dips, it's in heavy GPU areas. It's an open world game, so you can cause issues like any other title. So whacking out loads of light sources with Shadowcasters cause issues, lots of depth of field, sharp texture quality, motion blur, all those kind of areas that swamp the geometry in the screen, like talking to characters or cutscenes, they all cause dips. But it generally performs better on average on the PS5 than the Xbox One X overall, to a region of around 10%, and if it was allowed to hold VSync like the PS5 does most of the time, it does tear, to be clear. It would be even worse. So generally the PS5 is the best one, but I'm not going to make a big song and dance. It's not that big a difference in terms of performance, unless you get certain points where it does tear, and that's a bit annoying because it can tear more often than I like. So the last part we're moving to is loading. Now, loading is one of those strange areas, and as I covered at the start of the generation, Don't expect these things to just happen overnight. You have to have the ability to write and utilize the I/O infrastructure, the hardware decompression, and all those elements to make the best use of the hardware. And arguably, it's not going to be ready for another 6-7 months before we start seeing this in multi-platform titles, which means this is more often than not an old school title that's really boosted most by its CPU speeds, and that means that the Series X and the PS5 are the best of the lot. Now sit down, they're almost identical here. Now why is that? Because in my last test there was about a 12% difference, and that's because loading and streaming to the same point is a random area. So there's always more than one factor, and here it uses online shared saves with the Ubisoft servers, Xbox to PS4 and vice versa, and that means that certain things can affect that loading time and certain things can't. This is why the Xbox One X comes in at 76 seconds, and at other times it can come in at 50 seconds. So it just depends. Luck would have it, this is a longer one. That's just the way it goes when I'm testing these loads. It's not consistent, and that's the problem you've got with online sampling, online network connections, validation, check-in, all those kind of areas slow these things down. But generally across the board, the S, the X and the PS5 are the most consistent and the quickest in and out of games to load, save, move out, move in and go from dash. All of that is hugely improved, but that's down to the CPUs, the operating systems and the hardware. And as the generation goes on, we get more cross-generation games, arguably made by different teams at some point, like we saw with Rise of the Tomb Raider or Titanfall, then you'll see these bigger deltas appear. If you're going for the pecking order, if you're going from a last generation version or a 30 FPS title as I like to call it, then the Pro and the Series S are the best of the bunch. The Xbox One S and the Xbox One X are the worst in terms of performance, and then on the PS5 and the Series X, it's the PS5 pipping the Series X for its first head-to-head comparison. Visually, it's a good looking game. The character models, the texture detail, the assets, the density of the world and the interaction is much better. Great use of lighting, tessellation, all those areas are improved. Animation is very stifled. There's some strange cartoonish animations when you swing your axe and the lurching as you swing down. It doesn't quite suit the game itself, I think, and some of the animation is obviously very stifled and wooden, Thunderbirdy, but that's because it is an RPG now, so it has to use those kind of preset fixed range of animations and vertex blends to animate characters and movement rather than actually draw it. But overall, it's a good looking title. The 60 FPS performance mode is great, but I don't think we'll look back on it in 3 or 4 years and think it's a standout title. A good looking game, not a great looking game.
Let fate guide our journey. Are you ready?
He's right, it is time to go. Hopefully you guys and girls enjoyed this, and if you did, you can help the channel grow and support me by liking, subscribing and sharing where appropriate, and also commenting below. Remember, I'm completely self-funded and independent, and all the help you guys and girls give really helps me grow the channel and improve the quality. Anyway, I'm out, but I'll see you very soon on more Next Gen action.
Fractured land. So to England, glory and destiny.
To England!
To England! Or Valhalla!